before I get too far into this round, I want to say a huge thank you to my judges, to my amazing partner, and to our awesome opponents. Thank you guys for making it out. This round couldn't happen without you, and I love debating, so thank you for making it possible. With that, I'm going to get right on in to why my partner and I stand in strong affirmation of today's resolution: conservation should be valued over development. So just to define a couple of key terms we're talking about, conservation, according to Oxford, is the preservation, protection, or restoration of the natural environment or of wildlife. So we're talking about protecting the climate, we're talking about protecting all kinds of things related to the environment. And development is simply the process of developing or being developed. In this case, we're talking about developing the economy. So we're talking about when we use this land, for example, to build new projects or things that we believe will help the economy. These are things that often come into conflict, and when they do, that's when we have to choose what should be valued, which simply means prioritized or preferred. Our rank mechanism for today's round is cost-benefit analysis, so whichever side can show you the most benefit and the least amount of cost, or in our case, the most costs that come with development and the huge benefits that come with conservation. Our first contention is simply the cost of development, and our first subpoint is the climate. According to the United Nations, almost 75% of the world's fresh water is being devoted to agriculture and livestock. 60 billion tons of renewable and non-renewable resources are extracted and used every single year. In addition, urban areas have more than doubled since 1992 at the expense of forest and wetlands. And finally, fertilizer alone has produced more than 400 dead zones in the UK, not in the UK, specifically in the ocean, and these dead zones make up more land than the entire UK. Those are huge statistics of how our environment is already being affected by development negatively. And these are huge impacts, but they're being disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable, which leads me to my second subpoint: environmental injustice. According to Medical News Today, overwhelmingly, industry happens near minority neighborhoods. In fact, 75% of communities near harmful landfill sites are Black communities. This means that these communities are feeling the brunt of the cost, but what they're not feeling are the benefits. That's our third subpoint, which is unequal benefits. Again, they're getting all of the costs, none of the benefits. According to Joseph Stiglitz, in 2019, the global economy has tripled since 1978, but none of that has gone to the bottom 50%. The bottom 50% of earners, their wages have stayed virtually the same that entire time. Meanwhile, the wages for the top 1% has tripled. The benefits we're seeing of development are going entirely to the top 1% and not at all to the people that it's negatively impacting. Which leads me to my second contention, which is simply the necessity of conservation. We can't grow our way out of a lack of conservation. And the first subpoint is simply the monetary cost that it incurs. New York Times in 2021 shows a study from Swiss Re, one of the world's largest insurance companies. And they predict that a failure to check climate change will lead to a fall that is $23 trillion every single year in global GDP. This is a 20% decrease, Judge, in the global GDP. And this is just climate change, not even air pollution, not even water pollution, taking into account none of that. Our opponents can't come up here and tell you that development is going to cause a 20% increase in the global GDP, but we can tell you that climate change is going to cause that 20% decrease. Our second subpoint is it disproportionately harms the most vulnerable. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the most severe harms from climate change affect low-income populations that don't have the resources to always prepare or recover from the effects of climate change, such as flooding. And finally, our last subpoint is that it's not just climate change and money. It can actually cause death. The World Health Organization says that air pollution causes 6.3 million premature deaths every single year. For comparison, the pandemic caused 6.3 million deaths, around 6 million deaths total. So this is every single year we're having those 6.3 million people die, and we simply can't get that cost back with development.
2 minutes up? Make sure. Everybody ready?
Yes.
Cool. Begin on my first word. Great speech, but naturally I have a couple of questions. So how do you plan on conserving without development?
Right, so specifically what we're talking about with conservation should be valued over development is when the two are kind of coming into conflict with one another. So we have land that we could either turn into a strip mall, or we could decide to not turn into a strip mall.
Right, you said they're in conflict with one another. Don't they need to work in tandem to be able to achieve conservation?
I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to here. The resolution pretty clearly asks us to make a choice between conservation and development.
Right, I'm asking, but to achieve conservation, you need to develop ways to conserve, correct?
development specifically here is talking about economic development, not just like developing things in general.
Yeah, of course, but you have to fund these conservation efforts, correct?
So when we talk about conservation, we're talking about things like preserving the climate, which sure, we can quote unquote like fund, but we could also do things like regulate companies that, for example, emit CO2, emit air pollution. There are things that we can do to help conserve the environment that aren't strictly like funneling money to
Gotcha, so you said the
conservation
way we're gonna
efforts.
fix this is through regulation. Is regulation defined under conservation?
So regulation was just an example. Conservation is pretty broadly, as we put, the preservation, protection, or restoration of the natural environment and of wildlife. That's a pretty broad definition. It can include a lot of things.
Gotcha, just to quickly clarify one of your examples of your evidence, so you said there's 400 dead zones within the oceans, correct?
Yes.
What
so
kind of
that's-
development is that from?
Fertilizer specifically is what's produced those 400 dead zones, so I would assume agricultural development.
Agriculture development causes 400 dead zones in our oceans, right? Is that what, make sure I'm
Yes,
on the right page?
yeah.
Okay. And then next you talk about the fresh water and 600 tons of, what was extracted? You said natural resources?
So that was 60 billion tons of renewable and non-renewable resources. So we're talking everything from water to natural gas. We're just using a huge amount of resources every single year.
Right, is it just saying they're being extracted? Is there any kind of evidence that says where it's going or why it's being extracted, or are you just saying it's being extracted?
So it's being extracted, I would assume, for the purposes of some form of economic development. That's usually why people will go into the ocean and mine and take materials.
I've got 5 minutes on the clock. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Partner ready? Righteous. Hi, my name is Hadley Adkison, and I am representing the University of Arkansas, and I'm incredibly proud to stand on the negative of today's topic, conservation should be valued above development. In today's speech, I'll be doing a few things. First off, giving you just our basic intentions, and then if time allows, I'll get some rebuttal. If not, my partner will get to it. Let's go ahead and get started. First off, one should not be valued over the other. In today's speech, you're going to realize that's kind of the thesis of the neck argument here. We recognize that in order for us to continue to develop, not only as a society, but to continue to exist on this earth, we have to do so not in a conservation way and not in a developmental way. We need to do it sustainably. Ned today is going to tell you why that is preferable to just prioritizing conservation. Let's start with the first contention here, eco-building and sustainable development. First off, there are 3 goals to sustainable development to conserve energy future. The first is minimize depletion of natural resources, something Affirmative is really strongly advocating for, but we recognize it's not sustainable on its own. Secondly here, promote development without causing harm to the environment. And I'll give you some really cool examples about how we've started to do that. And thirdly, use environmental friendly practices. Why? Because development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs is the entire idea of sustainable, conservative development. Let's understand here from the BWI, Black and White Investments, as minority-owned real estate developments and construction services businesses. Eco-construction, also referred to as sustainable construction or green building, proposes various possibilities of reducing impacts of buildings. It's not one specific method, but it uses a lot of different techniques and materials and tech, which means not only are we investing in making the buildings themselves more sustainable, but the process in order to do that research and development becomes more sustainable. That's the future of this planet. Recognize here that the efficient use of energy, water, and other resources is integral to the use of eco-building. Secondly here, protecting occupant health, improving employee productivity, reducing waste, pollution, and harms to the environment are the cornerstones of sustainable development. The exact thing that Affirmative wants to see, but in a practical plan. Let's understand that through sustainable design, construction and operations, green buildings are reducing carbon emissions, energy, and waste, conserving water, creating safer materials and less toxins, and they are utilized by the Green Council, meaning we've created a sustainable portion of development that allows us to conserve the resources we so desperately need, like water, like building space, and like wildlife, but doing so in a way that humanity can coexist with it. Recognize here about the Shanghai Tower. It was actually created and has a second skin around it that is entirely utilized to create its own ventilation system, meaning it's not pulling from the energy grid, and it's done in a way that allows individuals to be able to enjoy all the benefits of a developed society without the negative impacts of taking away things from nature. Secondly, here, the Taipei Public Library, at the edge of Amsterdam, is a 1 angle square for Manchester, meaning it's become created entirely to give land back to these like nature and nature reserves, but allow humans to utilize those spaces as well. That's incredibly important. If we don't work together, either we or the environment perish. The only way both of us coexist is if we do it side by side, which is what the World Bank here says. Environmental and social framework sets our World Bank commitment to sustainable development through a bank policy and a set of environmental and social standards that are designed to support borrowers' projects with the aim of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. Let's look at a key fault that the affirmative brings here. They only recognize, right? They see that like small minorities are the ones that typically have these industry near them without those benefits. However, they fail to recognize that if these developing and third world countries don't have the opportunity to develop, they'll never be able to conserve properly. Development is inevitable. We need to create a sustainable way to do so. Which brings me to my second contention here. Development is inevitable. The National Institutes of Health says conservation efforts need not wait until development is complete. They must happen in tandem if we are ever to survive. But secondly here, recycling ideas, biodegradable equals failing. At the point that these biodegradable options aren't even that successful in keeping these pollutants out of our systems and our environment, the conservation efforts we see right now are not enough. We must combine them. My opponent, my partner, will get to a little bit more of this in the next speech, but I want to leave you with food for thought here. Harms of one over the other. AF is proposing protectionism. While it sounds good, it doesn't do enough, and it puts us all in a box. With sustainable development, we turn that box into a greenhouse and flourish for the future. Thank you.
All right, are my judges ready? And my partner? And our opponents? Great, and our wonderful audience. Great, then I will go ahead and begin. So really quickly, before I get too far into the round, so you're arguing that we should work to preserve, protect the environment, that kind of thing.
I'm saying that we need not worry about prioritizing one over the other. We need to develop sustainable development practices in order for us to have any option of conservation even being successful.
So are you arguing they both need to be prioritized like the same amount?
Yeah, I'm saying that neither one should be valued over the other. They have to work in tandem.
So when it comes into conflict, when we have a limited amount of resources and we can use those resources to either mitigate air pollution or to help make some factory that will help industry.
Can you give me an example of a time in which those two have come into conflict in recent years?
I don't have a specific example, but I think it's pretty obvious when we look at things like the US budget, but also it's cross-examination period, so I'm gonna continue asking the questions if that's okay.
Yep.
So quickly, going back into your case a bit, you talked a bit about efficient use of water and e-building, and you also talked about how the current efforts we're doing in conservation are not enough. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. And then you also said that development is inevitable.
Yes, it is.
Does that prove that that development is inherently good or has any benefits?
No, what I'm saying is because development is inevitable, we have to do it utilizing sustainable development and valuing both of these principles together.
Right.
Otherwise, we're leaving third world countries in the dust and massive amounts of forest in the US where none of those things are equitable.
Okay, perfect. And then finally, did the affirmative ever actually argue protectionism at any point during this debate?
That's simply what you're saying. If you're saying we need to protect something at the cost of something else, that is protectionism.
Okay, thank you. Y'all ready? And are you ready? Yes. And judges, are y'all ready? Okay, awesome. Let's begin. As this is my first speech, I also want to start by thanking everyone for being here. To our judges, thank you so much for taking the time on a very late night. I look forward to hearing your feedback and hope this is enjoyable for you. To our opponents, congratulations. You deserve to be here. I'm certain it'll be a great round on a really interesting topic. And thank you to my partner for being the best partner in the world. With that, in this speech, I'm going to be going through the negative case, refuting each of their contentions, and telling you why at the end of the day you can still feel very comfortable voting in the affirmation in today's round. So
right off the top, and of course this is kind of the crux of their case, so this might sound quite redundant as I move throughout my speech, but right off the top before their contentions, they say one should not be valued over the other, and as a result you should vote in the negation. But judges, as Hannah points out in our constructive and in cross-examination, the resolution itself puts these principles into conflict. The resolution is asking you to choose one over the other. This isn't something that we're drawing up, it's what the resolution is asking of us. Whenever Hannah was reading out our definitions, she specifically said whenever these things come into conflict, what ought we choose? Our opponents don't contest this in our definitions whatsoever. They don't negate the idea that these are coming into conflict in the resolution. So insofar as that's what the resolution is asking us to do, we must separate the two and decide when they come into conflict, what should we value? That's what we're debating today. But nevertheless, let's move to their contentions. Their first contention was eco-building and sustainable development, and they talk about how there's a mode of development that could be sustainable and produce environmental protection. First of all, they do not tell you anything about how prominent the use of sustainable development is or in how many instances it's being used. Our opponents tell you, we'll give you an example of how this is working and then give you one in Shanghai. But they tell you not at all how this is constituting the majority of development or that any other nations are pursuing it at all. Insofar as that's the case, that leads us to our second response. The negative does not have the power to change the nature of development. If you look to your ballot or if you look to the resolution, the only thing that you as the judge have the power to do is decide between conservation and development. You don't get to change development or conservation as they presently exist. And as they presently exist in the real world, development is frankly not sustainable. Remember, we live in a world in which in the last several decades, though we've seen our global wealth nearly triple, we have not seen any environmental protection nearly at all. Remember, we've devoted 75% of our fresh water to agriculture and livestock. We've extracted 60 billion tons of resources. So at the same time that we've been developing, we have been destroying our economy. That's what development looks like. And they don't get to tell you that as the judge, you wave your magic wand and make development something else. That's what development is. It doesn't protect the environment whatsoever. So while it may be the case that there is some alternative out there that could be used, it's not being used right now on at least any legitimate scale. But even if it was, that's not what the resolution empowers you to do as the judge. Furthermore, furthermore on the idea of sustainable development, even if this was possible, that many countries were using it, that it was leading to environmental protection, they still do not guarantee that those benefits would go to the least advantaged. Remember, we proved that overwhelmingly the benefits of development don't go to the poor. They go to the top 1%. And the fact of the matter is, judges, we don't need development, we do need conservation. Right now, we have seen our economy grow tremendously. We've seen the richest people get only richer. The question today shouldn't be, do we get much richer? The question should be, do we protect the single planet that we have to live on for the rest of eternity and the rest of human existence? That's the question that you ought to be preferring in today's round. The second contention was that development is inevitable, and our opponents say you can't conserve until you develop. But first of all, why at all is this the case? Remember, Hannah gives you an example in cross-examination. You don't necessarily have to develop or be economically prosperous to conserve your climate. For instance, Hannah gives you the example of regulation. You can regulate the use of carbon in your economy without necessarily being extremely economically prosperous. You can also simply leave land as it is. You can preserve it by just letting the natural habitat flourish instead of developing on it. That's conservation within itself too, and doesn't require any economic output whatsoever. So these necessarily do not have to go in tandem, and there's no logical reason to believe that they should. But secondarily, this resolution tells us nothing about the actual resolution. Development could be inevitable, and it would tell us nothing about what we should value. Even if development is happening, we still ought to value conservationism over development, because remember, the benefits of that development aren't going to go to the people that need it the most, and the costs of that development are overwhelmingly going to go to the most disadvantaged that are already disadvantaged in our world. So at the end of the day, judges, the resolution asks us a simple question. When these come into conflict, what ought we value? And the answer is quite clear. We ought to value the one that actually has the power to save lives, to restore communities, and protect the only planet that we will ever be able to live on, and that's planet Earth. Thank you.
Alrighty, I've got 2 minutes on the clock. Judges ready? Opponent ready? Perfect. Partner ready? Awesome. So as usual, great speech. I naturally have a few questions. So how does conservation solve for all of these issues that you've brought up?
Solve for the issues of what exactly?
Solve for the issues of individuals continuing to live in poverty, solve for the issues of climate change, solve for the issues of deforestation. How does conservation alone solve those problems?
Well, remember that most of the disadvantages outputs of climate change go towards the impoverished, which further impoverishes them. So literally by just conserving the environment, you do mitigate the
So
effects
we
of
have
poverty.
to stop all of these developments and all of these outputs in order to conserve.
No one is arguing that we stop development entirely. We're arguing that if they come into conflict, we ought to choose the one that conserves the environment over the one that
How
develops
often
the
do they
economy.
come into conflict?
Whenever they come into conflict.
Okay, cool.
It's irrelevant to today's
So
round
there's
because we're
not
talking about
enough-
those instances in which it happens.
Cool, but you can't quantify how often those instances happen.
I mean, I don't think there's really a source that says like 56% of the time environment and development come into conflict.
Okay,
It's just,
cool.
the resolution asks us, whenever they do, we ought to choose conservation as a
Perfect. My partner will expand on that.
Sure.
How do you define should be? We
Which-
never got a definition.
Oxford denotes obligation, duty, or correctness.
Okay, cool. And then how did you define development at the top of your last speech?
I didn't define it at the top of my last speech, but Hannah's definition
Your partner.
was simply, I think it was like the expansion or growth of something, and we said specifically to the economy.
Okay, perfect. And then is it not net ground to pick one or both?
In some instances, but in the instance where the
How is this
resolution
one
specific,
different?
well, the resolution, the instance in which they come into, resolution asks us a question about which we should choose over the other, then we have to make a choice. And if you guys were going to contest that they were in conflict, I wish you would have done it before your third speech, because we're now halfway through the round, so.
Okay, cool. So nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the NAG has the ground to go against the resolution in its entirety.
I'm not arguing that you can't go against the resolution in its entirety.
Okay, perfect.
Alright, 4 minutes on. Everybody ready? Coolio. Begin on my first word. Hello, my name is Austin, representing the University of Arkansas. Going to be second speaking for side negation. We got a lot to get into, so I'm going to give a quick roadmap. First, I'm going to give the refutation on my opponent's on case. And with the time remaining, I'll give some refutation on what they did upon our own case. So let's get straight to the case. First, they talk about their first contention. Well, first, we agree with the weighing mechanism and the definitions. Except we did get a definition a little bit late. Of course, should be, obligation, fine with that as well. And weighing mechanism, cost-benefit analysis, we agree with as well. So let's get straight to case. First contention is going to be cost of development. They talk about the major harms with quote current development, which is freshwater 60 billion tons, urban development is 2 times 400 dead zone in the USA. I prompted kind of specifics about this. They just said, well, people are dumping fertilizer in the ocean causing 400 dead spots. These are kind of two big correlations to make, but alas, I digress. But they don't talk about how conservation in itself fixes any of this. It was completely dropped in the last speech whenever we talked about how conservation, as of now, doesn't work. We talked about how biodegradables don't work. We talked about how recyclables is a failing system. That was completely dropped in their last speech, so any kind of efforts they do is flawed because the current system of which we conserve doesn't work. So if they try to get up and say that, well, conservation does work, it does not. We proved that in our second contention. So if they try to say conservation fixes these dead zones, fixes this urban sprawl, fixes the freshwater being taken, and the injustice in the community, these just are not true. So we move on to the second subpoint where they talk about injustice, where 75% of communities near landfills are minority groups. Two counters of this. First one, again, they don't talk about how conservation affects this at all. They don't talk about how, fixing the situation or conserve, as they say, leave the land. They don't say how that fixes that problem at all. Whenever you take into account eco-building and actual development, you're able to help develop these people to be able to get them into situations where they're not A, living next to landfills, or B, living in these impoverished areas. Then we move on to their global economy point where they talk about how 3 times, not to the bottom one, you can tie this as inflation. That's usually how that works when you have 3 times an increase. Then you talk about how conservation, again, doesn't really solve this either way. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but that's pretty much, they have no solvency. They don't really lay out any specific impacts, and I'll get to that in their second contention. Second contention where they talk about necessary of construction. They talk about how it's a $21 trillion. They try to throw this big number at you. They don't give any bright line of when this starts, when this 21 trillion begins. They just say it's going to happen at some point. That doesn't really give us a broad definition of when this 21 trillion is going to start affecting the GDP. We genuinely have no clue when that's going to start. It's just a big number to try and scare you into voting for the affirmation. Then we continue on about vulnerability, talk about low income hurt with flooding. my partner and I are not God. We cannot prevent natural disasters. I don't know what they really want us to do about that. We can't develop or conserve natural disasters. Then they talk about how death with air pollution is a millions dead. We give you the Shanghai Tower, which talks about how it's protecting air pollution, not protecting air pollution, attacking air pollution, and how these ideas of eco-development is able to develop and to use these ways of ecological building to be able to put air pollution lower, to be able to fight climate change. My partner and I are actually advocating to do something against the current climate crisis, while my opponents are saying, verbatim, leave the land as it is. And we can see that there are two examples of trying to fix it. Neither of them work, which is why you vote for the negation. Now with my time remaining, I'd like to get into some refutations. First, it is very clearly never stated in the resolutions that we have to choose development over conservation. It is either A, we choose development over conservation, or they should work in tandem. My partner and I advocate for both. So if you don't vote for one or the other, you still vote for negation. So then we talk about they fight against us, where they talk about how prominent it is and how you can't change natural development and it's not sustainable. We give you the top 3 reasons where minimize natural extraction, no environmental harm, and environmental helps, and it helps the people around it develop themselves. So when they talk about how it's not sustainable, it just plainly is. We give you the same card where environmental and social framework sets out World Bank's commitment to sustainable development through a bank policy and set of environmental and social standards that are designed to support borrowers' projects in the aim of ending extreme poverty. So the negation actually does bring solvency to the table when we talk about that, which is why I urge you to vote for negation, and I stand for crossings.
Judges, are you ready? Great speech. Just a couple questions. So you talked at the top about some examples of conservation that don't work. Can you list the examples again?
Yeah, it was in our second contention where we talk about how recyclables don't work and biodegradables also don't work.
Okay, are those the only forms of conservation this time around?
No, but you offer none other.
Okay, do you agree that like carbon capture exists?
I never heard it in your speech.
Okay, so then you talk about how you're not God, basically, and you can't like prevent natural disasters. Do you agree that climate change increases the prevalence and the regularity of natural disasters?
Yeah, but what I was getting at with that point is conservation doesn't really do anything to prevent those either.
Okay, so if you like, for example, like curb carbon emissions, could that perhaps curb the anthropogenic consequences of climate change like natural disasters?
Sure.
Okay, how prevalent are the uses of sustainable development?
Yeah, we give you multiple reasons about how current policies are being able to use. We give you examples of where it's being used.
Or could you like give them again?
Yeah. So my card is on the case over there, but we talked about the Shanghai Tower, and then we talked about three other locations, which my partner brought up, and we also talked about current global policy that's going on through the World Bank.
Okay, what was the policy?
Yeah, I read it on my last speech. I'll read it again.
Yeah.
Environmental and social framework sets out World Bank's commitment to sustainable development through a bank policy and a set of environmental and social standards that are designed to support borrowers' projections, the aim of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared profit.
Okay, and do you have any evidence that development will change the problem of the unequal distribution of the benefits of development?
Do we have any proof that? Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, do you believe that development would produce more economic benefits for the economically disadvantaged?
Absolutely.
Okay, what's your basis for that?
Yeah, so pretty much whenever you're able to give these people, no environmental harm, minimize the natural extraction, you talk about the ways that are more fundamentally available to where people can build, ecologically safe homes. You're able to put them in said homes through ecologically safe standards.
We've got 4 seconds, so thanks.
Gotcha.
Alright, 3 minutes on the clock. Judges ready? Opponents ready? Awesome. Coolio. Since this is my last speech, I just want to go ahead and say thank you for judging, thank you opponents for picking a really cool topic, and thank you partner, this has been righteous. So let's go ahead and get started. In today's speech, I'll be doing a few things. First off, just going down 3 general clashes that have made the debate a little bit muddy, and then explaining why the negative has the ground on all of them. Before kind of just giving you a little bit of framework, if I do have time, so the final focus is easier. Let's start with this first clash, right? Neg ground. My opponent says that they gave you ground in speech 1 that these two are in direct conflict. I got up in my very first speech and I told you we think they can both exist together. Obviously, we don't agree that they are in contention with one another, especially when the IPDA Constitution gives negative the ground to decide to either support the resolution as it's written or not support it as it's written. This doesn't necessarily say you have to pick one over the other. It says one should be valued above the other. We don't agree with that. We're in negative. We're on negation. We think they should be valued equally. You flow to the negative on that point. But secondly here, when it comes to conservation efforts, my opponents try to tell you all about carbon capture and cross-examination and about how that's going to fix things without bringing up any evidence about it or even mentioning it in the entire constructive period. Let's go ahead and talk about what they did bring up. Regulations, and leave it alone. Let's go ahead and understand why those don't work. First off, my opponents, unfortunately, live in quite of an ivory tower here. They're not recognizing the entire other half of this world that does not have the privilege of being able to completely halt development and regulate their companies through the government. At that point, some of these developing countries absolutely can't regulate those companies. One, the government's not powerful enough. Two, they simply don't have the means to do so because they need those companies producing enough to make sure nobody falls back into poverty. At the point that my opponents have given you a very American and UK-centric case, you flow to the negative. When we show you how developing countries, unfortunately for them, development is inevitable. We must give them an option that allows them to value both conservation and development the same. That's the only way they're going to be able to A, protect their future, but B, protect the present generation, like I told you in my very first speech. But this last clash here, right, is going to talk about how development is inevitable. Mia came up here and told you quite a bit about how this means nothing because it doesn't give anything to the resolution. Recognize here, if development is inevitable, they are always in constant clash. At that point, negative wins. We can never value one over the other. Development is constantly happening, whether it's research and development, whether it's new economic practices, whether it's new solar, wind, or hydroelectric energy. Development is constantly happening. What we need to do is value conservation alongside it so that we don't get stuck in this one eye for an eye situation where we're constantly ruining the environment to help our own selves. Humanity can only exist when we grow a greenhouse and continue to allow society to flourish. Vote negative. Thank you, judges.
Alright, are my judges ready? Awesome. And my partner? And our opponents? And our audience? Great, then my timer. There we go, now we should begin. I will go ahead and begin. So as this is my last speech, one more huge round of thank yous. Thank you guys for all coming out and making this debate possible. With that, I'm going to get back into a couple of reasons that my partner and I stand in strong affirmation of today's resolution, and then my partner's going to come up and give you some reasons you can feel comfortable voting in affirmation at the end of today's round. So let's start at the very beginning with the affirmative first contention, simply the cost of development. So basically, the entire response that they had to all three of our subpoints, the climate, environmental injustice, unequal benefits, is simply that it doesn't solve the problem, that we're not proving conservation is going to actually solve any of these negative effects. Well, first of all, the only real evidence that they have that it doesn't solve the problem deals specifically with biodegradables and recyclables, which I think we would all agree and have been debating this entire round does not constitute the entirety of conservation. Conservation, as we defined it and as my opponents agreed, is the preservation, protection, or restoration of the natural environment and of wildlife. We've been talking about lots of things throughout today's round, everything from regulations, regulation of carbon emissions, to specifically lots of other things that we can do that are all considered conservation under this definition. It's not just biodegradables and recyclables. That's obviously not the only solution. And all of the things that we brought up, the effects that we have to the climate, the effects that the terrible effects that we have of development are going to be solved again, are going to be not existent really if we stop prioritizing development. If we prioritize conservation over development, we're starting to not see those costs happen nearly as much. And they're costs that my opponents can't refute for today's round that affect the most vulnerable, like we talked about in our own case. So now let's move on to our second contention, which is simply the necessity of conservation. And we talk about three different subpoints. Our first one is the monetary cost. And they basically say we don't know when this monetary cost will start, so maybe I should be a bit more specific. We are talking specifically every single year. There's a prediction that climate change will lead to a fall of $23 trillion in the global GDP. That is a 20% decrease in the global GDP every single year, Judge. And this was specifically from, like I mentioned earlier in my case, well, if I can find his name, Oh, there we go. Swiss Re, which is one of the world's top insurance companies that tries to predict risk that we're going to face in our world as a whole. This is a huge deal, Judge, because again, we're talking about this happening every single year. And then we talk about, and they can't refute that. So then we talk about the second subpoint of disproportional harms to the vulnerable. And they say, well, we can't change natural disasters, but admit in cross-examination that climate change is the cause of these natural disasters, meaning addressing this initial cause is actually what's going to help us prevent these disasters from happening in the first place. Finally, we talk about death, and they say, well, we can fight air pollution other ways. So they think it's a good idea to fight air pollution? That's great. We agree. That's why we want to prioritize conservation and prevent these 6.3 million deaths every year. Now let's move on to the negations case. They basically start at the top by saying it's neg ground to think that both should be valued equally. But we proved to you in today's round why they shouldn't be valued equally. Again, development comes with unique harms, and these harms are simply non-existent when it comes to conservation. Conservation, in comparison, has huge benefits and help mitigate the harms that we see from things like climate change. Now, if we talk specifically, they say there are only two things were quote-unquote regulations and leave it alone. These were simply two examples that we talked about for today's round. And again, we've proven why these examples are good ways to go about doing conservation, but they're not the only ways, Judge, and lots of those can be included in today's round. Finally, they talk about eco-building and sustainable development. And like my partner said in her last speech, the negation can't change how the world actually exists, how development actually exists. And the negation can't come up here and tell you that they can just magically wave a wand and hope that all development is going to be sustainable. Just because the World Bank does it does not mean that everyone does it that way. And they can't come up here and just say, oh, you're wrong, it is sustainable. So for these reasons, I urge a vote in affirmation.
All right, 4 minutes on. Everybody ready? All right, you know my first word? Hello again, my name is still Austin Keefe, still president of the University of Arkansas. Well, this is the last speech for the negation, so I'll wrap it up. Get ready to wrap up this last round for the night. Again, thank you my opponents for being here. Thank you my partner for being my partner, of course. And then judges, of course, thank you for being here. All right, let's get straight into it. I'm going to get straight into the final focus, going to our first voter, which is going to be the weighing mechanism of cost and benefits. I have on my flow a neat little T-chart that talks about the costs and the direct benefits. First, I'm going to go down the benefits of the negation. So we have eco-building, which talk about the reducing the environmental impacts, minimizing natural extraction, and protects the occupants that work on them and live in them. We can see that this type of development is extremely beneficial to anybody that partakes, anybody that lives in it, and anybody that thrives in it. Then we talk about more benefits, which which it protects the occupants, and we talk about how development, again, is inevitable. Some third world countries aren't able to just halt their development because we told them to do so, or because it might be better for the environment. They don't have that choice. So by giving them this proper alternatives, such as eco-development, and we give you examples all around the world where eco-development has worked, is going to continue working, and is a better alternative to conservationism, you vote for the benefits of the negation. But alas, there are some costs, which the affirmation has proposed. Let's get to the first one, where they talk about their second contention, where millions are going to be dead. Again, this is just kind of like an over-exacerbation whenever they talk about this climate crisis, which they compounding on top of that, they talk about the $21 trillion in GDP, saying every single year, I have not seen a $21 trillion decrease in our GDP. Again, they didn't say when this is going to start. They haven't said it's already started. We genuinely have no idea when this number is going to start. It's just kind of a number to try and fear you into voting for the affirmation. Next, we talk about the low income. We talk about how eco-development helps the impoverished by allowing them to work on their own homes, to live in them without leaving such a big carbon footprint. Following on, they talk about 60 billion tons, multiple dead zones, but they don't talk about sustainable ways to solve it. They just say, throw conservationism at it, and it'll probably work. Again, this is from atop a tower where they don't see the actual impacts of their implementations. They just say conservationism is going to fix all of our issues, which leads me to the second voter, which is going to be solvency. So if we look at the affirmations case, we can see that their ideas of solving things is regulation, and then as I said in another speech, lots of other things. We don't know what these other things are. We just said regulation and other things. We can see that actual examples, which my partner and I give of recyclables and biodegradables, don't work. We can see that the examples that they gave, such as regulations, there's no specifics on that. They don't know who's implementing regulations, just regulations, and we can see that there's no specific sources, examples, etc., of proving why this is going to be an effective way to halt development. Following on, again in development and solvency, we can see that the negation actually provides efficient ways to fight the climate crisis. Affirmation does a fantastic job of pointing out the issues, negation solves them. We talked about the entirety of our first case, talking about how it's inevitable, and then going on to our second contention where we talked about the ideas about the eco-building, and we follow on about sustainability and how it is inevitable. So if we follow on through inevitability, we can see that negation wins this through impact calculus. Next, we do on to our third and final voter, which is going to be in tandem. The resolution, nowhere does it say that we have to force development over conservationism. As a negation, as my partner stated in the Constitution, we have the ability to choose development over conservation or both. We are choosing both. So we say, my partner brought up in their last speech, where they are constantly in conflict because we don't work with them. We don't work to make them work in tandem. My partner and I are trying our hardest to be able to thrive in a future where development is inevitable, and negation gives you the best way to actually get there. And we talk about this with multiple cards, where we give you examples all around the world of eco-buildings working, how they're working, how people are participating in them, how it's actually solving an issue, giving solvency. And then we give you a worldwide economical point through their definition of economy from the World Bank standpoint about how this is a worldwide issue, how this cannot just be singularly scoped to their examples, such as the USA and England. We give you worldwide examples of why you still vote for the negation. Thank you.
All right, another? And judges are all ready? All right, awesome, let's begin. This has been such a fun round on a very interesting topic. Thank you guys for being such phenomenal debaters. It's been really fun. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, judges. With that, in this speech, I'm going to go over a brief observation, and then I'll move into the affirmative voting issues, the reasons why you're going to feel very comfortable voting for the affirmative in today's round. So right off the top, that observation that I promised, what conservation really means. If you look back to our definition, the definition of conservation is the preservation, protection, or restoration of the natural environment and of wildlife and climate. Now our opponents go on and on and on about how we don't give you specific examples of conservation, about how we don't give you specific evidence about how specifically effective conservation has been, that we don't give you evidence about who would implement it. Judges, the fact of the matter is that we don't have to. This isn't a policy round. We're not debating about which specific policy should be implemented. We are talking generally about what values we ought to have. And as the affirmative, we're simply saying that you ought to have the value of conservationism over the value of developmentalism. We don't have to give you specific statistics about how much economic output these values are going to have, right? It's just not the nature of the resolution that we're debating. With that out of the way, let's look to the voters. The first voter is the most vulnerable. Now our opponents say that we speak from a position of privilege, that we speak from an ivory tower in telling these disadvantaged countries that they ought to halt their development. Now implicit in that argument is an assumption that their world would actually help the disadvantaged, that it would help those nations, that we'd be telling to halt development. And the fact of the matter is they don't, for two reasons. First, remember, development does not help the disadvantaged, point blank, period. We give you evidence that in the past several decades of economic development, the bottom 50% of earners have earned nothing. The top 1% has seen their profits triple, whereas the bottom 50% have seen absolutely no benefit. So even if it was the case that they're still developing, they're not going to see the benefits of it, even if they continue to do it. This is the case also for sustainable developments. Even those kinds of developments, our opponent can't give you any evidence, have actually produced any benefits for the least advantaged. Secondarily, development uniquely harms the disadvantaged. Remember, we proved that 75% of industry exists near black or poor neighborhoods. So the effects of climate change are disproportionately affecting the poor. They're not actually helping the disadvantaged in their world. So we don't speak from a position of privilege. We speak from a position that would actually help the disadvantaged far more than theirs would. Let's look to our second voter, and that's the nature of development. Remember, our opponents cannot tell you to wave your magic wand and make all development sustainable. We have to look at what the on-balance development looks like and what on-balance conservation looks like. And right now, development is just simply not sustainable. We've seen this through the evidence and been over it several times. And the final voter is that conservation is vital. Remember, judges, at the end of the day, we cannot grow our way out of this climate crisis. We have one Earth, and right now, people are dying, and our economy is headed for destruction if we don't do something. At the end of the day, once these two principles come into conflict, the choice is clear. We must choose conservation.